Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. On behalf of Child Poverty Action Group, I'm very happy to welcome you to today's event. We've very much been looking forward to it, and we are thrilled to be joined by this fantastic panel of speakers. Today's event is called Changing the Wallpaper, as you may know. The name comes from a 2018 paper on social work and poverty, which described poverty as becoming the wallpaper of practice because it was too big to tackle and too familiar to notice. So our aim today is to start changing some of the conversations around poverty, to get everyone here to start noticing the wallpaper again so we can change it together. The focus of this event is Wales, where almost a third of children are now growing up in poverty. What our panel of researchers and activists are going to try to show us today is how poverty awareness and anti-poverty approaches can help us all achieve better outcomes for children and families affected by poverty. So before I introduce our first speaker, I just have a few housekeeping details to go over. So I'm sure many of you are used to these by now, but at the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat box and a Q&A box. Please feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourself, to comment on the discussions. A couple of my colleagues will also be in the chat box to participate in the conversation. So please feel free to use it. And if you have any questions for our speakers, we do have a Q&A box as well. Please pop your questions in there, and then we've got a dedicated Q&A session at the end of today's event. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. You should also see a button that says CC at the bottom of your screen, which should enable you to turn on live transcription. It's automatically generated subtitles, so they're not perfect, but they can help some people follow along. So if you want to do that, it's just at the bottom right of your screen. And finally, if you want to join the conversation on Twitter, please use #ChallengePoverty, and you can tag us at CPAG UK. I think that's about it for housekeeping details. So now I would like to go right ahead and introduce our first speaker, Morag Treanor. Morag is Professor of Child and Family Inequalities and also the Deputy Director of iSphere, which is the Institute for Social Policy, Housing, Equalities Research at Heriot-Watt University. She is the Deputy Chair of the Scottish Government's Poverty and Inequality Commission. She's also Associate Director of the Scottish Centre for Administrative Data Research, working on a strategic impact program to link and analyse children's data, working in collaboration with policy colleagues at the Scottish Government. The primary focus of Morag's work is child poverty, its measurement, causes, consequences, mitigation, and prevention. Her research focuses on the impact of poverty on children's social, education, and health outcomes. Morag, the floor is yours.
Hello there, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me here today. I'm going to share my screen now. I have 15 minutes to speak. I have a timer on, and I am going to be quite rapid fire because I always have far too much to say. So bear with me while I share my screen. And we shall get started. So I'm presuming everyone can see that fine. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is ending the stigma. I've done many research studies over the last 20 years, and what I could have brought to you today are many examples of stigma and how it affects people. And that would have been, it would have led to a very interesting display of what this looks like and what this feels for people. But actually, I want to take it a step backwards. I want to go back a step and think, I want us to all to think and to think together about where does the stigma come from? Why is there such a stigma? What are the roots of that? So we're going to today look at, we're going to look at four things. One is why it's important to understand what poverty is and what poverty is not. We're going to come on to looking at what happens when we get the risks and the causes and the consequences the wrong way around and confuse them. We're going to look at what the situation actually is like for children in Wales in numbers. And then I'm going to talk about how that all leads to stigma, and then how that's internalised as shame by people. So this is from the work of the Scottish Government, actually. What their idea of the causes of poverty are, and people experience poverty because of a combination of low income and costs that are too high for those income. And the way that the economy is designed locks people into poverty. Now that's really useful and really helpful. It sets it out up front that poverty at its core is about a lack of income and about costs that are too high, living costs, housing costs, fuel costs, which obviously is very, very current in the news at the moment. And there are multiple factors that can create and reinforce poverty and make it worse, and that's the pay insecurity, employment, caring responsibilities people have, the lack of adjustments for people with disabilities, discrimination, the low value we place on some kinds of work such as retail work, caring work, catering work, and what is known as the poverty premium. So these are understood to be the causes of poverty, but what that does not stop happening, either in the media, in discourse, even in practice, it does not stop the understanding the myth that poverty is somehow caused by people's individual characteristics, their laziness or their fecklessness or their bad behaviour. The UK government got rid of the poverty targets, the income-based poverty targets, and said what being in poverty looked like and what it was caused by was things like worklessness and low education and being in debt. But these things are not causing poverty. These things are arguably often the consequences of poverty. They increase the risk of poverty massively. And sometimes they then, in future, can increase the risk of a cycle of poverty happening, if you like. Worklessness, for example, over 70% of children in Wales who are in poverty has a parent working. But the adverse consequences of poverty means that your access to, your equal access to, an ability to maintain and be to participate fully in your education is constrained by poverty. Your ability to do the same with training or to secure access, secure high quality work, these things are constrained by poverty and the factors that interact with poverty, as we'll come on to see. Why is this so important to understand what are the causes of poverty? If we think about this conceptually, how we understand the causes of poverty, how we think poverty is caused, determines how we decide to define it. And that's really important because how we define it tells us what our measurement is going to be. And what that means is a measurement allows us to monitor change. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? It allows us to compare ourselves to other countries and other nations in the UK. And if we know the proportion of children in poverty in Wales, what is it currently based on? Again, how we define poverty is really vital because how we define it dictates what we do to make it better. It dictates what the government is willing to do to make it better. So if a government decides that poverty is less about people's income, less about money, and more about their individual behaviours or their lack of education or their inability to get a job, then they have the perfect reason to take money away from people and not to increase people's incomes. This is why it's vitally important, because this is exactly what we have seen after 2010, when we saw a period of austerity brought in by the coalition government and the Conservative government because they got rid of the income-based poverty targets because they said poverty was not caused by income. Instead, it was caused by these other behavioural things that make people feckless. What they also did was, at that period of time, we saw these endless media reports saying that people could work if they only would work. And we had TV shows like Benefit Streets, I know there was one based in Cardiff, about how people are scroungers. And what this does is it sets up this idea of the hard-working people against everyone else. But what is the reality in Wales? Well, as you can see, at the top dark blue line is child poverty. Poverty are more likely to be in children than any other group of people in Wales and across the UK, but this is just Wales. And you can see that since that 2010 period, just after that, it starts to increase. That period of austerity shows an increase. This is workless households, the proportion of children who have an adult working in their home. If you go back 10 years to that first bar, if you look at the bar on the very left, 2007 to 2010, 50% of children in poverty had a parent who was working. That's the two pale blue bars, the 20 and the 30. That's someone working, and that's 50%. If you shoot forward 10 years to the final bar at the right-hand side, you can see that 71% of children in Wales now have an adult working. So that is a 42% increase in in-work poverty for children in a 10-year period. So we can't just keep thinking people won't work, can't work. We can't just keep telling people to go get themselves a job, because this is a design. This is not people's inability to get a job. If we look at by the number of children in a family, you can see again from that 2014-17 period, which coincidentally is the time of the Welfare Reform Act of 2016, I think it was, you can see the upshoot in families with 3 or more children experiencing poverty. It's getting close to 50% in Wales now. And that's because we have things like the benefit cap and the 2-child limit, which is still to come into its full effect because that came in 2017. So this is going to get worse for larger families. If we look at, they only started looking at the statistics, the top dark blue dotted line for children who have a disability in the family, either their own, a siblings or a parent's, you can see that they're up at almost 40% risk rate of poverty for children in Wales. And there are other groups also at increased risk of poverty. There's ethnic minority families at increased risk, and there's lone parent families also, I think, about a 46% increased risk. I didn't put the graphs in because I thought, you know, I didn't want to do death by 1,000 graphs, which I have a habit of doing. So is this a surprise to us? If we look at the UK's welfare spending, and this is from the government, the UK government's own statistics on how they spend welfare by age group, you can look at the yellow line at the bottom that shows the lowest amount of any group receiving money from the UK government is children, by a long way, and that has fallen from that period of 2009-10. You can see that that has nosedived. We are spending less and less on children and families than we ever had. This is a consequence of austerity. This is a consequence of deliberate policy making. This is a design. This is not an accident. And austerity has adversely affected women and children. They've been most affected by it. Is that why we haven't complained more loudly? Is that why we haven't taken to the streets as we did with the poll tax in 1989? Is it because this inherently gendered nature of austerity, of poverty, and its effect on women and children is something that we don't care about as much in our society? I think that's something to think about there. What do we think about women and their children who live in poverty? What's important to notice here, I'm about to show you one more graph of data from a Scottish study that I work on. The child poverty rate in Wales is 31% currently. In Scotland, it's currently 24%. What I want to show you is a graph about the dynamic nature of poverty. This is a study that has tracked children since they were born and has collected data on poverty since every year since these children were born. This graph is at age 9, and it shows you that only 47% of children in Scotland, remembering our child poverty rates are lower than Wales, only 47% of children in the first 9 years of their lives had never been in poverty, which means that 53% had actually experienced poverty. What does that tell us? That tells us that poverty is not a fixed population of people. Though that 31% of children experiencing poverty in Wales is not a fixed group. There will be people going in and out of poverty all the time, and you can estimate that probably between 50 and 60% of children in Wales are at risk of poverty in their childhoods. What are the consequences of this? More people than you realise experience poverty. Most of those families are working. That means that they're also not entitled to passported benefits like free school meals, etc., which can have so they may not come through the school system as looking as though they live in poverty. So you cannot tell who is living in poverty necessarily, but just by looking at them. And that's really important for practice. It's especially important for social work, who often see the deeper poverty levels and often think that, and the families they deal with, and think that that's what poverty looks like. So there's a lot of people living around the margins, and what often happens is parents and their children mask or hide their poverty. They mask what is a stigmatized identity. Nobody wants to be highlighted as living in poverty. And that means that they're terrified of social work intervention. Will I get my children taken off me if I fall into poverty? So they're likely to hide from you. So when we have these misunderstandings of child poverty, this leads to stigma. Because if we believe poor parental behaviour is a cause, then even among social workers and teachers, if we believe what we're being fed constantly in the media and by politicians, that there's somehow some sort of laziness or behavioural aspect to poverty, then of course you think you can see what poverty looks like and you stigmatise, you think it's a fixed group of people, you have a fixed perception, and you think it's all those particular people. And that's when people mask poverty to try and avoid that stigma. What's really interesting is how people internalize stigma, and that is shame. People feel very ashamed of their poverty. They try to hide it because they're exposed to these attitudes and behaviours, and even the tenor of the public debate, and it leads to their shame. Robert Walker's a professor at Oxford University, did a study of poverty across many countries. And what that showed is that actually, while the levels of material poverty in countries is different, you know, poverty looks different in India and different in Brazil to what it looks like in the UK, how it's experienced as shame, and the shame in things that people, and the emotional experience of poverty, the psychosocial experience of poverty is actually surprisingly similar across all those countries. So how poverty is felt is very much the same, even though what poverty looks like may be different. And shame is a key factor there. So looking at your practice, I have 1 more minute left. What can we do as practitioners? I think we do need training to challenge negative stereotypes, and negative stereotypes have been force-fed to people through the media and through the poor quality of the political debate in the UK generally. We need to put dignity and respect meaningfully and proactively at the core of service delivery, which has been written into the new Social Security Act in Scotland. We have such a thing now, and dignity and respect has been put as the sort of golden thread that runs through that act. We need to focus income and services at those families at increased risk of poverty, which is ethnicity, lone parenthood, higher numbers of children, children with a disability in the family. Because stigma is also used as a tool by politicians. If they can create the stigma, as they did throughout the noughties, those endless newspaper articles of people being benefit scroungers, if they can induce stigma in the population, then we will accept their austerity, we will accept what happens to us. So policy is deliberate and designed, stigma is used as a tool, and what we can do is focus on supporting those families at most risk and think about those intersecting inequalities that arise from things like the misogyny, the racism, the ableism, that people have higher levels of poverty if they're a lone parent, if they're disabled, if they're from an ethnic minority background. And I have managed, a couple of slides there to show you a couple of things, but I managed to miraculously stay within my time slot. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Morag. That was wonderful. And I saw a slide at the end, which we didn't have time to see, but it was about your book, Child Poverty, Aspiring to Survive, which I was going to highly recommend to any of our viewers today who are interested in delving deeper into any of the topics that you discussed in your presentation. So thank you very much for that. And now we are going to move on to our next speaker for today. So Allison Hulmes, just by way of a brief intro, Allison is a Welsh Romani social worker, and she is the co-founder of the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller Social Work Association. She's been a registered social worker for 21 years, and she's the National Director for Wales at the BASW, the British Association of Social Workers. She is a social work activist, and I think in her presentation we are going to see a little bit about the core group of social workers who walked 100 miles against austerity in 2017. Her professional practice includes children and adult safeguarding and being a practice educator on social work programs in Wales. She also undertakes independent assessments exclusively with Gypsy and Traveller children in care proceedings. Allison is a core member of the Drive to Survive team campaigning against Part 4 of the policing bill and promotes the equality and human rights of Romani and Traveller families in Wales. She's also very interestingly active in preserving the Welsh Gael language, which is on the point of extinction, as a fundamental human right to access one's Indigenous language as means of continuing ethnic identity, culture, and history. She is actively campaigning to ensure that Romani and Traveller families in Wales lead in the telling of their story on the new Wales schools curriculum. Allison, please go ahead.
Thank you, Leah, and I'm really happy to be here this morning, so thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. There we go, good. So my presentation is in two parts this morning. So part one of the presentation, I'm going to be looking at the particular impact of poverty on Romani and Traveller families. And in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to be focusing on what the British Association of Social Workers has been doing to really support social workers in having the confidence to see beyond the wallpaper of poverty. And in the first part of the presentation, I'm really going to be speaking from lived experience. So I think it's important to start with some statistics really to look at the structural disadvantage faced by many Gypsy and Traveller families. So I've got some findings from the 2011 census. We don't yet have the findings from the 2021 census, and it doesn't include Roma families because they were not able to self-identify in the 2011 census. So 26% of Gypsy and Traveller respondents who are economically inactive and of working age were disabled or were long-term sick, and this is the highest proportion across all ethnic groups. And again, it'd be really interesting to see if that's changed in the 2021 census. So Gypsies and Travellers also have the lowest rate of economic activity of any ethnic group, and that's 40% compared with 63% for other ethnicities in England and Wales overall. So is Britain fairer? The Equality and Human Rights Commission 2018 report revealed that Gypsies and Travellers had the lowest educational attainment rates at both primary and secondary school than any other group. So it appears that Britain is not fairer if you are a Gypsy or a Traveller. And of course, the not accessing not having equal access to education impacts on the ability of Gypsies and Travellers to enter employment, and particularly we don't enter graduate jobs, you know, we're as rare as hen's teeth. And another really shocking statistic is, and this is a 2021 statistic, you know, Watkinson and Al found that the health status of the average 60-year-old Gypsy and Traveller person is similar to the average 80-year-old white British person. So that's some of the sort of structural disadvantages that impact on the experiences of poverty for Gypsies and Travellers. And within that context, we then had the pandemic. So because of the types of employment that Gypsies and Travellers traditionally undertake, which is around self-employment, they really were forgotten in relation to government support, you know, around employment during the pandemic, and they didn't fit the criteria for the job retention schemes. And Many travellers traditionally work overseas. They work overseas as family groups, and this is what they were doing at the start of the pandemic. So they returned, back to the UK again into lockdown without any means of securing employment, and again, they were impacted by being locked out of government support around employment. Utility bills are more expensive in trailers, on sites, and a lot of that's to do with the type of the fabric of the homes that gypsies and travellers live in on sites. They're not as well insulated as some bricks and mortar homes. So utility bills during this time increased. And also lots of families living in trailers rely on cala gas to heat, and also for cooking within the trailers. And because of lockdown and lots of shops shutting, they were unable to access cala gas for basic amenities for living, such as heating and cooking. I think it's also really important to understand that historically, gypsies and travellers have not looked to the state for support, and that's around the experience of centuries really of discrimination and disadvantage and suspicion of the state. And also gypsies and travellers would not automatically look to social services either for support. So they're often locked out of entitlement because of suspicion of the state and historic experiences of oppression and discrimination. They're locked out of support from social workers, again around that experience of discrimination by the state. So often within gypsy and traveller families, women assume unpaid caring roles. So they assume unpaid caring roles. They themselves are locked out of employment, but they also do not benefit from entitlement. So entitlement in relation to benefits, and also entitlement in relation to having their support needs assessed and met by social services. So it's no wonder that families are reporting to NGOs that they're increasingly getting into debt, and this has been amplified since the start of the pandemic. So within this context, we have the police crime sentencing and courts bill. So I don't know if you know very much about that, but Part 4 of the bill specifically impacts on gypsies and travellers, and nomadic gypsies and travellers. So it's going to create a new criminal offence of intentional trespass. Normally trespass is part of civil law. It's not a criminal offence. The Police Federation, civil organisations such as Liberty and the Ramblers do not support the criminalisation of trespass because of the infringement of civil liberties, and also because there are sufficient powers already under civil law, but also using other parts of the criminal law as well to manage to manage trespass. And really, Part 4 of the bill is a blunt instrument to essentially reinforce assimilation and to eradicate gypsy and traveller culture. It's a populist, it's a populist measure, by this government to essentially deal with, the gypsy problem. And it's really important to understand that nomadism goes to the heart of gypsy traveller ethnic identity and culture. The stopping places, the action towns, to us are sacred places. They're places that our ancestors had stopped at for hundreds of years since we first came into the UK. And I think something else, I think Morag was talking about sort of being on the margins and being less visible. And I think it's really important to remember that in terms of the importance of nomadism and being on the road, we are aware that there is overrepresentation of gypsy and traveller children in state care. Many of us, have experienced this within our families and the intergenerational harm that this causes. And often, children who have been in care from gypsy traveller families, who have not been raised within identity, not been raised within culture, take to the road as a form of self-healing, as a way of identifying, re-identifying with culture and with ethnic identity. And when this bill will go through, this bill will become law, we're campaigning for amendments. That's the best that we can do at the moment, but we don't believe that there will be any significant amendments, and it will go through as is. So essentially, we will be, criminalising potentially people, gypsies and travellers who have already been harmed by the state when they look to self-heal. There are solutions, and part of the solutions are to create stopping places and negotiate stopping places, but this government, has no will to do that. In Wales, there is a duty to assess and provide for the needs, both sites and transit for gypsies and travellers in Wales under the Housing Act 2014. But since the bill has been implemented, there have been no new sites and no transit sites have been created. So the impact of the bill in Wales could be different. It could be different if transit sites had been created, but they haven't been created. So the impact of the bill in Wales will be exactly the same. And we know that most sites, most traveller sites in Wales are inadequate for a dignified life for human habitation. Morag talked about dignity. There is no dignity in the way that gypsies and travellers live on sites within Wales. So if we look at the penalties for Part 4 of the bill, and this is really important in terms of increasing the impact of poverty on gypsy and traveller families. So the penalties are up to a £2,000 fine and or imprisonment for 3 months and removal of a vehicle. And again, there's quite a bit to unpack in that. So we've looked at some of the structural disadvantage, for gypsies and travellers. I've talked a little bit about the impact of the pandemic and the sorts of occupations that traditionally, the sort of employment that traditionally gypsies and travellers would undertake, and they're being locked out, from entitlements for historic reasons of discrimination. So, if you start to impose these kinds of fines, when we already know that families are getting into debt, we feel that, we're going to essentially thrust gypsy traveller families, into destitution. When we look at 3 months imprisonment, if we take away the main wage earner from gypsy traveller families, again, this is going to increase, poverty and the likelihood of homelessness and destitution. We know that gypsy and traveller males in particular are again overrepresented in prison. And probably the most, the most awful part of these penalties is the removal of a vehicle. Vehicles represent for gypsies and travellers their primary mode of ensuring they have employment. But beyond that, the vehicles represent a home. So essentially what the state is going to be doing is removing a family's home. So we will find ourselves in a situation, where there is already poor relationship and suspicion between gypsy travellers and social workers, and this is going to create an environment where social workers are going to be, pulled into enforcement action. There are very few foster carers who come from gypsy traveller families, so there's a likelihood that more gypsy traveller children will be taken into state care, and we perpetuate that cycle of discrimination by the state. So what can we do about it? So we need to talk about it. We need to understand, the environment. We need to understand, I think, Morag talked about the impact of poverty on certain ethnicities and on lone parent families. So we need to understand, I think, more about how poverty impacts on Romani and traveller families. And we set up about a year ago the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller Social Work Association to really ensure that a focus is given to Gypsy, Traveller and Romana families, because we believe fundamentally that change has to come from the grassroots, and it has to come from those of us who are of the communities. We believe that we have to be leaders in change. Also, in relation to the bill, Leah spoke a bit about our campaign, Drive to Survive. So there I am standing under the Melissa Fawcett statue in Parliament Square back in July. Courage calls to courage everywhere. So we are working with civil organisations. We're working with legal firms to gain support to try and remove Part 4, or then if not removal, then ensure that there are amendments. But we know that's not going to happen. We know it's going to go through as is. But we're a grassroots organisation. We are led by mostly women from the communities. The women in the communities are strong women. We are activists. So we started off our campaigning in Parliament Square. Then we went to Appleby. Appleby Fair happened this year, really significant cultural event for Gypsies and Travellers, and we also campaigned at the Conservative Party conference a couple of years ago. We will continue as an organisation campaigning to highlight the impact of the bill, and the Act when it's implemented, probably sometime next year. And please look up Drive to Survive, follow us on Twitter, and support us, please, in raising the impact of this on increasing disadvantage and poverty for Gypsy and Traveller families. Right, so I'm going to do a bit of a step change now. So I've talked a little bit about the impact of poverty on Gypsy and Traveller families, and particularly the current context of the bill. So now I'm going to talk about, social work. So what is BASWA doing, and what have we done to try and support, social workers name the wallpaper, because they see it, they bear witness to it, it's there, it's front and centre. So social workers have always been involved with raising the issues around poverty and standing alongside people. It's at the roots of our profession. It's where we started, and it's embedded into our code of ethics, and also into the international definition of social work. So social work engages people and structures to address life challenges. It promotes social change and development, empowerment and liberation of people. So it's an imperative for social workers to be active in addressing poverty. So how do we do that? So we do that really, through standing alongside, through collaboration particularly with people with lived experience, with user groups. And in this picture, you can see this lovely picture is us on a march. It was a march that we undertook in 2018. We walked from Blackwood to Cardiff, and that's our beautiful banner. And it says social workers and service users against austerity. Again, really important, that we visibly and actively stand along, one another, and that social workers amplify the voices of people with lived experience. We also, one of the other things that we did was to form the Anti-Austerity Action Group, and that was really important, really, in focusing, our campaigning and our direct action around a defined group. Member voice, again, is really important in putting a responsibility on the association to ensure that we're focusing on really important things like poverty. So in 2017, hello?
Sorry, please keep going, Allison.
Okay, I think I'm probably coming to the end, aren't I? So so our members, put a responsibility on us, to directly focus on areas like poverty. So we had the anti-poverty motion in 2017, and that was a really important motion because that led to us developing specific anti-poverty practice guidance, and also came at the end of our march between Birmingham and Liverpool in 2017. And again, the march was really important because again we were demonstrating that social workers were willing to take direct action, to walk alongside people who were suffering the impact of welfare reform and of austerity measures. And part of the importance of that walk was, we walked along the streets and the roads because we wanted to meet people, we wanted to talk to people, we wanted to hear their stories. It was really important to hear their stories, and it was important for them to see social workers standing up for them. Again, kind of breaking down some of those myths and stereotypes, that there's antipathy between people and social workers. Well, we were standing there absolutely in solidarity. I've got a film, and I don't think I have time to show it, but hopefully the PowerPoint will be shared, and I'd really encourage you to look at the film because it talks about the people that we met on our walk. It talks about the food banks and the charities that we visited, again, to hear people's stories. On the final day of the walk, we visited a mental health support service in Speak just before we went to central Liverpool. That was in 2017. They were talking about then the impact of cuts on their service and what that meant to the people that were using that service. A year later in 2017, that service became a victim of the cuts. So there's a picture. So
we can share the video along with your slides when we circulate. We're going to circulate a link to the recording. So if you'd like us to send that video as well, we can share it to everyone who signed up for today's event.
Thank you. So I think it's probably time for me to round up. So two very important things happened from that anti-austerity motion that came out of the 2017 AGM. One of those was we developed a campaign action pack. Now this is for social workers as citizens because they were telling us we want to get involved in activism, but we don't know how to do it. So we developed this with the Campaign Collective to support social workers, in being activists in their own time as citizens. The other thing that we did was we developed an anti-poverty practice guidance for social workers because again, social workers bear witness, it's not wallpaper, they see it, they feel it, they hear it, they're impacted, personally impacted by it. So we needed to give them the tools to really talk about poverty in their assessments, to ensure that it was front, right and centre, to feel that they could make a difference, that they had agency, and this was one way of doing it, was providing social workers with the tools to do that. And this was developed in collaboration with the Child Welfare Inequalities project and following extensive consultation with our members, but also the wider social work profession. Very quickly, some of the campaigns that we have been involved with, universal credit, the two-child cap. Again, the two-child cap has impacted disproportionately on Gypsy and traveller families because they tend to have larger families. We've been involved in the school holiday hunger campaigns, homelessness, that's us standing with an organisation called No One Left Outside Alone. And our current one is lived experience fair remuneration campaign. So we're campaigning for a close in the tax and the benefits rules which prevent people with lived experience becoming involved and influencing the services that impact on them the most. And I think I can end there. Diolch am wrando. Thank you for listening to me. Cwsti divas. I hope you all have a good day. Diolch.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Allison. Can I just check that you can still hear me okay? Can you hear me, please?
You're quite quiet, Léa.
It wouldn't be a Zoom webinar without some tech issues. I'm going to try to get another microphone. In the meantime, I think we can go straight on to our next speaker. Unfortunately, Omar Mohamed was not able to join us in person today, but he has kindly sent us a recording of his presentation, which Ellie is going to play for us now. Omar helpfully introduces himself in the presentation, so I'll leave the introducing to him. Ellie, are you able to share Omar's presentation, please?
Hi everyone, my name is Omar Mohamed. I'm a BA3 social work student at the University of Birmingham. I have lived and living experience of poverty, and I'm an activist. I'm going to be talking about kind of how we can move from poverty aware to anti-poverty social work practice and recognizing poverty as a social problem. So my kind of experiences with poverty come through kind of three main areas. This is lived and living experience of kind of social work intervention from around birth to around the age of 16, and kind of living in both relative and absolute poverty. But then also as a social work student committed to social justice, human rights, and social transformation. I have been kind of focusing, definitely in my first year, all of my assignments were about kind of arguing the need for poverty-aware social work. I've also had kind of a lot of experiences of learning from experts by experience. And I've also had my first placement as a social work student was with care leavers and refugees who were heavily reliant on universal credit and are definitely, receiving the kind of the negative side of universal credit, especially with the £20 cut and the reduction of the COVID allowance as well. And then also kind of external social work experiences. So I've worked with ADT Fourth World on a couple projects. I've led an anti-poverty webinar, and I've written a few articles and delivered quite a few presentations now on poverty, just because it's something I'm so passionate about. And of course, with these three different areas of my experiences with poverty. So in terms of kind of my lived and living experience, I had social workers kind of coming in and out of my life, kind of living on a variety of different council estates. I think I moved around, up to 20 times in and around London. And, as I say, this was living in both relative and absolute poverty. There were times where I was living in a garage, which, wasn't kind of fit for kind of humans to live in, really. And then kind of, when I think about my lived and living experience, I always like to draw on kind of intersectionality, because, as a very kind of working class family, but then also an Asian British family, I was kind of, dealing with, like a double-edged sword is what has been said in some of the research about kind of, the impacts of poverty and racism, and how that kind of intersects. And yeah, I've definitely, had experiences where I've been impacted by that. And in terms of kind of the practical support that I was offered, there was none of it. So, I had over 15 social workers in and throughout London, and, kind of none of them were able to give kind of practical support. How can we move out of poverty? It was more kind of, why are you in poverty? And, you need to get out of it. It was a very kind of individualized way of working, and yeah, I think my whole family was kind of blamed for being in poverty, and there was a lot of kind of bias and judgment and discrimination, just based on being kind of working class and Asian and that kind of thing. So in terms of kind of external social work experiences, so ADT Fourth World is a human rights international charity. And I particularly love how much they involve people with lived experiences, and how involved they are in kind of this decision-making processes. And I've worked with a few people from ADT Fourth World on some different projects. I've led an anti-poverty webinar, which I have a link to at the end. And this was an amazing webinar with an audience spanning up to kind of thousands of people. And that was all about kind of, how we do move from poverty aware to anti-poverty, but with a host of amazing guest speakers. I've written quite a few articles, and, a lot of these have been on kind of, if we want to build better relationships with the people we work with, then we need an understanding of poverty, because we need to be working with people in this, almost fight against poverty, which is a very kind of socially harmful and structural problem, which I'll talk more about. And then, of course, delivering presentations has been an amazing thing, and I'm glad that my voice is being valued, both from a kind of lived experience side, but also as a social work student who is very passionate and wants to get my voice out there about these issues. So yeah, as a social work student, committed to social justice, human rights, and social transformation. I've had quite a few assignments arguing about the need for poverty-aware social work. I've done kind of articles kind of linking that with with COVID-19 and how COVID-19 has highlighted the need. I've had quite a few experiences learning from experts by experience, and they're kind of help with some of my articles. And then I have quite a few placement experiences with care leavers and refugees who are dependent on universal credit. And then just kind of seeing how socially harmful, some of the policies are, in terms of universal credit, and just how limiting life is living and being dependent on universal credit is, kind of having £250 a month, to be able to, fund all of the needs that, humans need, kind of basically, but then also, what humans would like to do with their lives, and actually, instead of surviving, this whole idea about thriving and actually living life. And I think it's just really just very, it cannot be acceptable that we live in a society that would rather punish the working class and people living in poverty, rather than transforming society into a more fair and equitable and equal society. And then, unfortunately, due to policies within poverty and austerity, there's been many deaths. There's people who have starved on benefits and, literally been found in their home days later, literally died due to starvation. There was a mother and a baby who also, died due to being on no recourse to public funds and not being able to access any, anything of the welfare state, really. And I think when we have cases like this, when we have inhumane experiences like this, we need to be questioning ourselves, as a social work profession, are we committed to social justice and human rights and social transformation if this is the reality of things? So I just want to talk a bit about poverty-aware social work practice. So how I see it is it's about being aware of poverty and its relationship in social work practice. So, how it kind of shows up as the wallpaper of practice. And kind of what is meant by this term, and, a lot of researchers are using this, kind of poverty is the wallpaper. It's something that's always there, but it's never really talked about, and we should be more aware of it. And I would say that poverty should be the elephant in the room, because it is. A lot of the impacts of poverty are extremely harmful to the social lives of people. And unless we recognize that, we're going to fall down that path of just blaming people being in situations they're in, rather than kind of addressing poverty as a social problem. And being poverty aware, I almost feel like poverty is recognized. It's sometimes in assessments, when working with people with lived experience and service users, but nothing is ever kind of done about it. We talk about, this family can't maybe meet this goal, for example, or this task, or this outcome, because maybe they can't afford it. But what's done about that? How are we actually going to empower and liberate and kind of, when we think about social transformation, what are we going to actually do to improve things? So it's really, really important that we recognize poverty is a social problem. So it's a social problem within structures, institutions, systems, and the whole of society. And this therefore has an impact on individuals, families, and communities. But poverty is not seen as this. Poverty is seen as this impossible just thing that we can't overcome, and it's impossible to overcome. However, social workers should be kind of better engaged in looking at poverty as a social problem, as a political problem, And social workers should be, having a louder voice and a more important voice in the kind of policy making arena, challenging harsh and harmful policies such as the £20 cut to universal credit in England. And yeah, we need to be radical and we need to advocate for social transformation if we really want to, call ourselves a social justice profession. And yeah, poverty is a problem. However, social workers are in a powerful, privileged position to improve the lives of victims of a socially harmful political and social choice, which is poverty. So, my advice is that we start to move towards a kind of understanding of anti-poverty social work practice. So this requires a few steps. So anti-poverty social work practice is kind of about understanding, treating and approaching poverty as a social problem. So that's the first step. And then what we need to do is we need to start to take some meaningful steps to kind of critically reflect on poverty's impact on individuals, families and communities. We can do this by kind of working with individuals, families and communities to combat the impacts of poverty, and then using our professional power and knowledge of resources, policies and legislations to empower and co-produce solutions out of poverty. And I think the most important aspect, and I say this more on, as a person with lived experience, is that we need to not blame individuals, families and communities for being impacted by poverty, which is not the choice of people living in poverty. So, we do need to move away from individualizing the problem and blaming people, and we need to see it as a social problem that needs to be tackled on a collective level. I just want to mention Protecting Children, a Social Model by Featherstone, Gupta, Morris and White. Just because, this is something that I have read and I feel, really, really clearly lays out a way that we should be working, at least in children and families. But, I see this being adapted to adult social work as well. And, this kind of model and way of working is kind of, first we need to understand and tackle the root causes. And then we need to kind of rethink the role of the state. In doing this, we can start to develop relationship-based practice and co-production, and then kind of embed a dialogic approach to ethics and human rights in policy and practice. And for me, that kind of outlines in a very kind of, research way, but that to me is anti-poverty social work practice. So what can social workers do? Firstly, take an anti-poverty and social model approach to working with individuals, families and communities, and then work collaboratively with those impacted by poverty, kind of act against harmful policies, critically reflect on social work values around social justice and human rights when poverty is involved, and then be understanding, be empathetic, and be constructively angry, because we should be angry. Poverty is not okay, it's socially harmful, it's killing people, and we need to be doing something about that as a social justice profession. So here are some of my references. Really, a lot of the reading here is kind of what has, inspired my passion and allowed me to really kind of theoretically understand poverty as, a very harmful, social problem, which I knew as, a child going through it. But, kind of looking at what the research says is a really interesting way of kind of kind of understanding poverty. So those are just the kind of references and what kind of, kind of enables me to think about poverty. And then here are just some further materials. So, a link to when I won the BASWA Social Workers Union student essay competition about kind of relationship-based practice and poverty-aware practice, kind of working with ADC Fourth World, my Social Work 2020 during COVID article, and the anti-poverty webinar. But yeah, thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you so much, Ellie, and a big thank you to Omar, who is not here with us today, but that was the best pre-recorded presentation I've ever seen, and I kept forgetting that he wasn't actually here, and I kept nodding along to his points and then remembering, oh no, this is a video, so he can't see me nodding along and agreeing. So great, thanks everyone. We are now going to take a short comfort break. So it's now 11:04. We're going to restart at 11:09. So see you all in about 5 minutes. Make sure you get something to drink and hope you're ready for some more great speakers after the little break. Thanks everyone, see you in 5. welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone managed to get some rest during this little break. I find them very important, especially when we have 2-hour-long sessions. I find that it's helpful to just take a breath, have a little break, have a drink of water, and then come back refreshed and ready for some more amazing speeches from our speakers. So our next panelist this morning is Martin Elliott. By way of bio, Martin is a research fellow in the Children's Social Care Research and Development Center, also known as Cascade, which is based in Cardiff University. Martin is a social worker with 17 years children's services experience, including frontline management and practice, contracting and commissioning, and strategic development work, both in England and in Wales. His research has largely focused on the relationship between poverty and inequality, and families' contact with statutory children's services. Martin was also part of the research team which worked on the 4-nation Child Welfare Inequalities project, and he has also undertaken Welsh-focused inequalities research through his doctorate and the Health and Care Research Wales-funded Child Welfare Inequalities in Wales study. That was a bit of a mouthful. Great. Now, Martin, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. I'm now going to attempt to do the most stressful bit, which is share my screen. Are people able to see that?
I am pleased to report that we can see your screen.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so good morning. As Leah has said, I'm Martin Elliott. I'm a researcher in Cardiff University. I'm going to present briefly on ideas of child welfare inequalities and explain a little bit about what I mean by that, or what we've come to understand by that, and then very briefly explore some of the issues around how we turn those ideas into practice and ways of working with families who live in poverty. We're now very familiar with this slide because everybody's made reference to the fact that it's the Wallpaper social work practice. That quote is actually drawn from a paper which was based on the Child Welfare Inequalities project, which I'm going to base my talk on. And it was in context of talking about poverty as being unremarkable and unremarked upon in a lot of social work, not all social work, but when we did observations of practice, of people's day-to-day practice, quite often it wasn't visible. It was in some cases, but it wasn't there perhaps as much as we would imagine. This idea that poverty is the Wallpaper social work practice, I guess on one level is unsurprising if you think about the historical context of the development of what we now call social work. Those sorts of endeavours have always predominantly, but not all entirely, focused on those living in the poorest places, in the poorest circumstances. So from that context, I guess it's not that surprising. There's an international literature around the links between poverty and coming into contact with children's services, of having children placed on the Child Protection Register, of having children looked after. That spans decades and spans continents. So we're quite familiar with the ideas that there's some sort of relationship between the two. I guess what a lot of that research lacked was some idea of scale, of exactly how much impact poverty has on your likelihood of coming into contact with child welfare services. And I think that was the main driver behind the Child Welfare Inequalities project. So the Child Welfare Inequalities project was the idea of Professor Paul Bywaters. Paul, by background, did an awful lot of health research, where ideas of inequalities are well recognised, embedded. Again, have been an idea that's been used for decades, but it hadn't really been used as a lens to think about children's social care in the same way. So what Paul wanted to do was apply that inequalities lens to children who were either on the Child Protection Register or who were looked after by the state. as I say, I think in terms of inequalities research, we're very familiar with that sort of approach in education and health research. And I think importantly, one of the issues is that not only are we familiar with talking about inequalities when we're talking about things like health, we're also familiar with the idea that these are things that we should be doing something about, and that we should be addressing and seeking to reduce. So if we think about things like life expectancy, the idea that sitting where I am today in one of the lesser deprived parts of Wales, if I get in my car and drive 10 miles up the road to somewhere that is in one of the most deprived parts of Wales, in that 10-mile car journey, my life expectancy on average would reduce by about 5 years. We're familiar with the idea that we ought to do something about that. I don't necessarily think that historically there's been that kind of thinking placed on social work and social care. So the study looked at social work practice across the 4 home nations. So I worked on the part of the study that was focused on Wales. I also, as Léa mentioned in the introduction, I also did a separate piece of work as part of the PhD, which looked only at Wales. So we looked at practice across the piece rather than just in one place. I think one of the central ideas within health inequalities research, or inequalities research as a whole, one of the central sort of themes is this idea of a social gradient that for each step increase in deprivation, the outcome that you're looking at, whether that's life expectancy or birth weight or a whole range of things, will get worse. And that's quite a sort of a linear thing to happen. So the graph that you can currently see on screen is taken from my PhD. So I looked at all of the children who came into care in Wales over a 6-year period at the first time they came into care during those 6 years. And I looked at their home addresses. I looked at them by neighbourhood, by lower super output area, but for ease, we'll talk about it in terms of neighbourhood. And part of the reason that I had to do with that and use that as a measure was because actually we know very little about the household circumstances of families at the household level. Social work doesn't routinely collect data about whether people are in work, whether they're in receipt of benefits. So we had to use neighbourhood as a proxy measure for that. So what you can see is a social gradient. So on the left-hand side of your screen are the 10% least deprived neighbourhoods in Wales, and on the right-hand side, you've got the 10% most deprived. And the difference in rates at which children come into care from those two varies by almost 12 times. So if you're living in one of the most deprived places in Wales, you're 12 times on average more likely to be in care than your peers. And this persists regardless of how you disaggregate the data, however you slice the data. So if you break the data up by local authority, if you look at it by the reason the child came into care, if you did it by the sex of the child, if you did it by a whole range of factors, that gradient always persists. It varies, it gets steeper and shallower, certainly by local authority, but it is always there. What we also found was that there is a relationship between the number of neighbourhoods that local authorities had that were in the right-hand side of the graph and their overall rates of children in care. So the more deprived a local authority was overall, the more likely they were to have higher rates of children in care. That doesn't always hold. There are local authorities where that isn't the case. But overall, what we found was that there was a relationship between having more families who were living in poverty and having higher rates of children in care. Very crudely, about 50% of the difference between local authorities in the numbers of children that it had in care was accounted for by poverty. The other 50% was a whole range of other factors to do with organisational culture, resources within local authorities, and a whole range of other issues. As I say, the study that we did across the 4 nations looked at all 4 home countries, and we looked at data on one day in 1 year. So it was the 31st of March 2015, and made a comparison between those countries. I've used England and Wales rather than all 4 countries because actually it's probably the easiest to make the comparison with, because the legal system in terms of children being removed through the courts is basically the same between England and Wales, and varies quite dramatically between Scotland and Northern Ireland. And what you can see from the graph, hopefully, again, left-hand side of the graph is the least deprived places, right-hand side is the most deprived. And what you can see is that in England, the rates of children from the less deprived neighbourhoods are higher than they were in Wales. But once you get past the 5th decile, Wales increasingly takes more and more children into care than they did in England. I think in the flyer for today's event, Ellie very optimistically suggested that I was going to explain to you why that is, and I think the reality is we're not sure. We don't know, because we are at this level. We are comparing like with like. We are talking about neighbourhoods of equal deprivation, and yet Wales disproportionately takes more children into care from those neighbourhoods than they do in England. This is reflected in the overall rates of children in care. So if you look at rates over time at a country level, Wales has for decades had rates of children in care higher than England when you account for population. But actually that gap has got bigger. So over the years of austerity, so the last sort of 10, 12 years, that gap has got considerably larger, and we are yet to unpick why that would be the case. This is a quote that's been attributed to lots of people. I've seen it attributed to all sorts of people. One of those people is Desmond Tutu. I quite like the idea that it was Desmond Tutu that said it. And it's this idea that there comes a point where we need to stop pulling people out of the river, and some of us need to go upstream and find out why they are falling in. And I think in doing the Child Welfare Inequalities Project, at this sort of large, higher level, part of that was about painting a sort of an epidemiological picture, a whole population picture of what was going on, and going upstream and looking at things like the impact of national policy, of the welfare benefit system, of cuts in that system and changes to that system. But what we also did as part of the study was we also did observations of social work practice. We did focus groups with social workers, interviews with social workers. We sat and observed practice as well. And part of that was try to understand social workers' understandings of the relationship between poverty and the families that they worked with, and also the extent to which those things were visible within their day-to-day practice, were visible within their assessments. And what we found was that was really variable. Social workers, when we prompted them, had a very good understanding of these issues and the relationship between the stress and the day-to-day experiences of living in poverty and people's likelihoods of coming into contact with them. What became more apparent was the fact that those things weren't always reflected in their assessments of families or in the services that they offered to families when they were working with them. And what we found was that that social workers quite often were, in some cases, were quite polarised around what they thought about this, and some thought that poverty wasn't a social work issue at all. They were there to work with individual families at an individual level, and it was very focused on risk, as to an extent social work practice should be in terms of child protection, but that it became very focused on risk and without putting those risks and harms in their wider context in terms of people's circumstances and the societal harms that they were likely to have been exposed to, I guess. They quite often thought that poverty was too big to tackle. That idea of it, it's the elephant in the room and it's too big to deal with. That it wasn't, they didn't have the resources to deal with it. That a lot of the issues that we were talking about were too far upstream, so that, as we said, they had no control over things like the benefit system, and that local authorities themselves were squeezed and didn't have the resources to provide families with more than they currently did. There was also the idea that for some that at the point where they became involved, that it was almost too late. They quite often talked about providing financial assistance to families and talked about, well, giving more money to somebody at the point where we're involved with them is too late and won't make any difference. And I think that focus perhaps on the monetary, only on the monetary side of poverty and the impact of living on poverty is quite an interesting one. I mean, other people have made reference to the study by ATD Fourth World and Oxford University, which looked at the experiences of people living in poverty and was co-produced with people living in poverty. And they came up with this really useful, I think, sort of 6 dimensions of poverty. And yes, there is the impact, the day-to-day impact of the lack of money, but there is also all of these other domains and dimensions, which I think social work practice should take account of and be aware of. Morag in her presentation made reference to ideas of stigma, blame and judgment. I think recognising the stigma and blame that families in poverty face and the impact of further stigmatising them through things like the child protection process is really important. Social work legislation and systems are by themselves potentially disempowering structures. They have disempowering policies. They blame individuals, often without putting those in the context of wider harms. Thinking about things like financial insecurity, 0 hours contracts, that type of thing. The impact of poverty on people's health and well-being, particularly things like mental health. There's quite a strong relationship between having mental health problems and the likelihood of your child being removed and placed in care. There's also, for certain types of mental health problems, there's a link between poverty and suffering with those types of harms. Lack of choice and control over those choices, and the unrecognised struggle, I think, reflecting in thinking about where families are when social workers are visiting them, that the day-to-day struggles that people have with trying to get by, to make ends meet, to parent in a way that they would want to, but also the skills and contributions that people make in terms of volunteering in the local communities and supporting others. So there's a whole range of ways in which social work can acknowledge the living experiences of families, whilst also acknowledging that quite often, certainly in the current climate of austerity, there sometimes isn't actually that much that they're able to physically offer. But that working alongside and getting alongside and acknowledging and seeing people, seeing poverty, seeing what people are living with is part of working in a way that's relationship based. Again, in Allison's presentation, she made reference to...
Almost out of time. do you mind just going to your last slide, or is that the last slide anyway?
I'll very quickly pile through the slides that I've got. On the back of Child Welfare and Equalities Project, there's been a number of efforts to develop resources for social workers. So the BASWA guidance that Alison mentioned, there's an equivalent one which was developed with colleagues in Northern Ireland, which try and give social workers practical ways in which they can work in ways which are poverty aware or anti-poverty. Omar made reference to the social model of child protection. If people aren't aware of the book, I would recommend you go and have a look at it. My final slide is, I thought I'd end with a slide that actually used a quote from a Child Poverty Action Group publication. It's quite contentious, I guess, and potentially we could have a very large argument and discussion about unpicking what it means and whether we think it's true. It says it's been argued that social deprivations create problems which endanger the stability of some families. In response, governments have made little progress in reducing inequalities or removing poverty. By contrast, local authorities have been allowed to develop agencies well equipped to deal with the results of the problems, and that's by taking children away from their parents. I think about this quote a lot in my day-to-day work, and part of the reason for me thinking about it is this quote is almost 50 years old now. It was written by Bob Holman, who I have an immense amount of time for. I'm really keen on his work. Sadly no longer with us. But I think we need to think about, over the 10 years of austerity, the fact that numbers of children coming into care have massively increased, and the extent to which what Bob is alluding to here is or isn't true. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Martin. I'm sure everyone learned a lot. I'm sure I know for a fact that I did. And that final thought, I think, will remain with many of us. I think we will all be thinking about this after today's event. So thank you for that. We're running a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to whiz right on to our next speaker, who is Naomi Lea. Naomi is the director and founder of Project Hope, which is a project to tackle youth loneliness, and empower young people throughout and beyond the current pandemic. She also works with Mind as a young people's participation and influence officer, and she is an #IWill ambassador, encouraging and motivating other young people to take part in social action, as well as encouraging organizations to provide social action opportunities for young people in their communities. Naomi, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm just going to preface what I'm going to say with a little bit of a trigger warning. So I'm going to be talking about my personal experiences, so please take care of yourselves when you're listening. If you need to take a step away, that's fine. So what you're getting is my real life experience. I said in a meeting with some MPs recently, stats tell you one thing, but stories tell you another. Having grown up in poverty, I experienced many things a child should not have had to, with very little support, and I want that to be different for children growing up now, including my younger brother. Firstly, I'm going to share a video of me with my best friend, talking about our experiences of poverty. I've been best friends with Amelia for quite a few years now, having met through volunteering, but growing up in two totally different places, almost 150 miles away from each other. But it wasn't until the past year in our work with the End Child Poverty Coalition that we began talking to each other about our experiences, which I think portrays an important point that I'm going to ask you to keep in mind to come back to later. So I'm just going to share this video.
In the Midlands in England.
I'm Naomi, I'm 22 and I've grown up and live in Wales.
We've both experienced poverty in a completely different way.
I grew up pretty much in poverty from the moment I was born. There was a lot of kind of deprivation around me. Other people weren't worrying about what money they were spending in the shop and that they only had a few pounds to figure out the meals for the rest of the week, or that they had to choose food over having paid the electric bill or having the heating on.
For me personally, I didn't experience loads of poverty when I was much younger, But it suddenly hit me when my dad had an accident at work, and as a family, me and my sister were put on free school meals. It was something kind of a bit taboo. My parents never mentioned it. To be fair, I don't even think my parents knew, because I didn't know until I went to buy something for lunch to realise that actually I didn't have enough money to buy a simple meal. There is such a stigma attached even today in this society, where we think that everyone is equal and everyone has a fighting chance. But actually, if you grow up in poverty, there are so many more things against you. It affects your life and it affects your education.
The reality is that children who are really hungry, or that are having those worries about what's going on at home, it has an impact on their well-being, and therefore they can't learn, they're not prepared to learn, they're not able to learn in the same way, and that makes life really difficult.
That fear is something I've seen in so many adults even today. In a previous job, someone I was talking to was saying that they experienced poverty where they didn't have loo roll growing up, and they have subconsciously always ensured there is loads of loo roll in the house.
It can feel really difficult growing up in poverty and watching other people go and do their clubs, or they're learning their music instruments, and you're sat there like, I don't want to put that pressure on my parents. Like, I don't want to turn to my parents and say I want these lessons or I want to go to this club, because I know they can't afford it. And so you don't ask and you just keep that to yourself. Children should have that kind of view of the world where things are good, but actually growing up in poverty, you end up creating a worldview that's quite negative. So in my family, like, my mum was working for a large part of my life, but actually still didn't have enough. She was working a full-time job as a care assistant, and still that wasn't enough for us to live on. Like, there's something really wrong there that we need to sort.
I think definitely one thing that I think lockdown and COVID-19 has shown everyone is that things need to change, not just in the healthcare system and finance, but actually let's start talking about poverty. You've got families struggling now, and we need to do something about it today, not wait for another year or 2 years.
So as you've seen there, you've heard a little bit about my experiences and also Amelia's, but I wanted to share a little bit more about some of the experiences I had growing up. I grew up in a single parent household for 10 years as an only child before my brother was born. My mum worked as a care assistant and at one point was a manager of the care home too, but unfortunately we still didn't have enough money to live on. Childcare was often really hard, particularly when I was younger and my nana lived on the other side of the country. If mum was on call for work or had to go back to work for something, I often had to go with her, sit in the staff room alone, keeping myself occupied until she could finish. When I was around 13, my mum had to give up work due to struggles with her mental health and other disabilities which developed. I simultaneously became a young carer and had even more worries about how we would cope without my mum's income. It was at this point that I started receiving free school meals, which wasn't the solution it's always made out to be. Yes, it was a game changer, because I always knew I could have something to eat at lunchtime, but I felt so different from my peers. While my school operated a cashless system, so it wasn't obvious that I was on free school meals, it restricted my choice completely. The money you receive gets you whatever the meal of the day is, but that is often not what my friends were eating or even what I wanted. If my mum had a few spare pounds, she'd let me top it up so I wouldn't have to feel so different from the others. My brother unfortunately experienced a different experience during COVID. Without being able to go to the school canteen, orders were taken from the classroom, but only for those on free school meals, making it so obvious that that's what was going on. Luckily, my brother felt comfortable with that, but I know that I wouldn't have had I been the one in his position at his age. As I said in the video, it was often not that I was told that I couldn't access a club or a music lesson, but that I literally never asked. I didn't want to add to the pressure. Certain school trips, like skiing, were a no-go, but I was really lucky that my nana was able to pay for me to go on 1 or 2 of the school trips abroad so that I didn't have to miss out. I was essentially living only in survival mode, which unsurprisingly led to a combination of mental health problems as I got older. Counting up the cost of food as we went round the shop, putting stuff back at the till, waking up with electrics off some mornings and knowing we couldn't get any more until mum had the money, and as a teen my phone bill not being paid so I could no longer use my phone. I lived in fear of us losing the house or of bailiffs turning up and taking my stuff, a fear that I definitely still carry elements of with me now. In sixth form, when I began to receive my own money, having worked the summer before at a cafe and then receiving educational maintenance allowance, I had an unbelievable ability to save, but I often found myself borrowing money to my mum when she was in desperate need, often knowing I wouldn't get it back. It wasn't her fault. She had a great sense of pride and often turned down the help of food banks because she felt it was a sign of her failing. At uni, this continued, but I had the opportunity to start to have more choice. Receiving the grant and loan money meant I felt almost at a level playing field to everyone else in terms of paying for my day-to-day costs. I still did let mum borrow money from me from time to time if I knew they needed it, as I had my brother to think of too. The thing about all of this experience is that nobody ever acknowledged it. I was a high-achieving, quiet student, some might say a perfect student, and I slipped under the radar in so many ways. In fact, I was always striving to prove myself, to prove I wasn't the stereotype. Nobody ever acknowledged it or spoke about it, and instead I experienced discrimination and stigma, despite the many opportunities there would have been to ask. A lot of that experience came in primary school, at the hands of teachers. Mum was a well-respected member of the school's PTA and was chair for a number of years. She was once refused to bring the money home from the summer fair purely because we lived down there, aka the council estate. That wasn't the only time down there was mentioned in that way. There was always a surprise that I was one of the first children to go to the Welsh high school from our area. I would cynically say it was seen as the better school because it had a lower percentage of free school meals, but that's a different story. Because of where I lived, assumptions, unconscious or conscious, were made about what it meant I was expected to achieve, and I was expected to achieve less than my peers. Imagine the impact that has on a child's self-esteem. All of that just contributed to the shame I felt, so that I never really told anybody about my experiences. I felt totally alone in it and so ashamed, like everybody was going to judge me. To this day, I still live with the effects of growing up in that environment and personally consider it to have been a traumatic experience. I still experience things in my day-to-day life now that come from those experiences, even though I'm no longer living in poverty. In the past year, I have dealt with a couple of short-term work contracts, and the paralysing fear of being without triggered my mental health into an overwhelming spiral. I still look at my peers and wonder how they're able to do what they do, wonder how nice it would be to know I had parents with money to fall back on. I didn't get the travelling experience many students have, and I have no idea how anybody affords to do a master's degree after their undergraduate. But what I do recognise is that it's brought some positives, not because of, but despite the poverty. I would consider myself to be an excellent saver. I came out of university with savings and have kept that up as much as possible. I appreciate the little things I have and don't take for granted the treats I'm now able to give myself. I'm able to pay for private counselling so that I can do the healing I've always needed to do, because health professionals did not acknowledge it when initially I had therapy and it should have been picked up on. But I still live in fear that one day I will experience that again. Social action and volunteering gave me a voice about many things I've experienced, and this topic is no different. It was only in the last 18 months that I've spoken about it, firstly joining a project group of young people with similar experiences, where I found the confidence to let go of the shame of speaking out and creating change. And I have created deeper connections with my friends. I hope also I'm giving others the confidence to see through the shame they may feel and be empowered to own their experience rather than having to hide it if that's what they want to do. So what do I want you to take from what I've just said? Firstly, I want you to check your assumptions, even those that are unconscious. Never reduce somebody to their circumstances or where they've come from. Secondly, recognise that colleagues you work with may have had these experiences too and may even be living it right now. It's a topic not being spoken about enough and something that many will continue to hide. Be careful with your language and always be compassionate. Thirdly, don't just pay attention to the children who act up. Look at the quiet ones too, because they're often internalising so much and they deserve your support too. I was once told by a mental health team while in crisis that I had low resilience and needed to be more resilient, not that they offered any support for that. But please do not ever tell a child or an adult who has grown up through poverty or any trauma that is struggling with their well-being that they need to improve their resilience or be more resilient. Children with those experiences are some of the most resilient you will ever meet. Live a day in their shoes and you'd likely be experiencing very similar feelings. And finally, please talk about poverty and acknowledge it with the families and young people you work with. It doesn't need to be the elephant in the room. Shame can't survive being spoken, and we can all make a difference by having an honest and open conversation about it. No child should have to be growing up in this way, but it's unfortunately the reality for so many at the moment. I hope that progress can be made to improve the system, but until that happens, please keep talking.
I'm really pleased that this is being recorded because I'm just looking forward to listening to your talk again afterwards. So thank you very much for this, and lots of thanks for pouring in as well in the chat box. So that was great. Thank you so much. We are now moving on to our final speaker of the day, who is Janet Goodall. Janet is Associate Professor in the Department of Education and Childhood Studies at Swansea University. Her main area of research is family and parental engagement in young people's learning. She's researched, written, and lectured widely on this topic, working with schools, families, local authorities, and charitable bodies in the UK and further afield. Her most recent book, co-authored with Dr. Catherine Weston, is called 100 Ideas for Secondary Teachers Engaging Parents, and it follows on from their previous book, which was 100 Ideas for Primary Teachers on Engaging Parents, both available from Bloomsbury Education. Janet, thank you, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, and I want to thank all of the other speakers as well. This presentation kind of hones in and builds on everything that everybody else has said. And it's about why parents matter when we're talking about poverty, and when we're talking about the poverty both in this generation and the generation to come. So why should we care about parental engagement and learning? This is what I've been researching for the last 15 years. But the reason I care about it is that I think this is an issue of social justice. And I think it builds on what everything else that everyone has said so far. And we know from the previous research that, and you know as well as I do, children living in poverty, growing up in poverty, are likely to leave school without qualifications. And we've heard all kinds of reasons for that, but it's not about inability. It's about the societal systemic issues around them. They're more likely to leave school early. And according to the older research, they're likely to have lower aspirations. That's not true. And in a wonderful bit of kind of serendipity, I'm going to highlight one of Morag's papers here. Can we put the method of poverty of aspirations to bed now? What children growing up in poverty and families lack is not aspirations, it's scaffolding. And we need to realize that, and we need to jettison some of the ideas that other people have already talked about that sort of parent. That's what we know about parents, is that they care about their children. But the point is that there are links between educational underachievement and poverty and its attendance risks. And we need to think about that, and we need to think about why that happens, because it's not about ability, it's about systemic issues. Will parental engagement in children's learning solve child poverty? No, it won't. But can parental engagement in children's learning help children achieve and actually help us lead to a more equitable society? Yes, it can. And this quotation is from the work of Professor Kathy Silva and her team at Oxford. And what they were looking at was whether or not early experiences of education before going into school were beneficial, and not surprisingly, they found out they were. But they also found out what's on your screens now. For all children, it's the quality of the home learning environment that's more important for development. What parents do is more important than who parents are. And by home learning environment, one of the things she means is conversation, turn taking, reading with and reading to children. It's not about having the best of everything. It's about having conversations. So the benefits of parental engagement with learning are things like greater student self-efficacy. If you don't believe you can learn, you won't learn. But if you believe you can learn, then you will learn, or you have a better chance of learning. Higher rates of return of homework, higher rates of attendance, and improved outcomes, particularly for some of the most vulnerable children in our society. But it's important to understand what I mean by effective parental engagement. I do not mean parents going into school. I'm talking about engagement with learning, not engaging with the school staff. Effective parental engagement takes place outside of school, It's the interactions between parents and young people. And if you've ever been around a 5-year-old, you know that a 5-year-old's favorite word is why. What I would really like to see is a society where a 15-year-old's favorite word is why, where we don't quash that, where we work with that and continue that questioning, that curiosity. We know that parental engagement and learning, the really effective kinds, changes as young children grow up, which isn't surprising at all because the children are changing. For example, direct help with homework seems to be very effective in the primary years, but probably not in the secondary years. Whereas what's really effective in the secondary years is conversation. And we know that 15 minutes conversation a week with young people is correlated to their engagement with reading. It's about showing young people that we care, showing young people that we're interested. So the question becomes, why haven't we been supporting this kind of engagement? And it's a question that other people have been asking as well about different sorts of things, but the answer is much the same. We've known this for 50 years. Well, one of the issues is we're asking teachers to do something we're not training them to do. Very few initial teacher education programs actually talk about effective parental engagement. They talk about talking to parents, but they don't talk about supporting parents working with children. We also know that parents that are engaged with schools are often unrepresentative of the school, of the parent body, because the parents that come into school are the parents who are comfortable doing that. And also, what other people have talked about, the pervasive stereotyping of groups of parents, the culture of poverty discourse. And I think it's really important that we change some of the terms. And one of the terms that I really want to change is the way we use the term education. Learning is a huge concept, and it starts at birth, and parents have been involved in a child's learning since the first moment they encountered that child. Education formally is learning with formal rules. So yes, it's what goes on in schools, but it also is what goes on in a sports club. It's what goes on in a music class or a dance class, whether it's learning what a diminished fifth is or what the offside rule is, that's education. Schooling is a much smaller bit of that, and that's what goes on in schools. The problem is that we say learning when we mean schooling, and that enables us to shut parents, and by parents I mean an adult with a carrying responsibility for the child, so parent, foster parent, grandparent. But it enables us to shut others out of the process and say we don't need them or they shouldn't be involved. When in reality, what we're talking about is learning and young people's learning. And parents, community are intimately involved in that and must be if it's going to be effective. So we need to change the discourse, and others have mentioned these sorts of things. And Lanston Billings makes the really good point that if we continue talking about an achievement gap, we're talking about something that's been personalized, as other people have mentioned. She suggests that we start talking about an educational debt, so that we're not talking about the gap between those two students. We're talking about the debt that we as a society owe to our young people. And there is no they here. There's no they that we can say they need to do more about this. There's only us in a democratic society. And that changes the emphasis and the impetus from the individual, the collective, to the society. It's not just that children don't achieve, but that we are failing our children. And others have spoken of this culture of poverty discourse, but it relies on saying everybody in poverty is the same, which is ridiculous. And when you think about it with the front of your brain, you know it is. But we still soak it up in policy discourse. It's love for politicians. And again, you can see that I'm mentioning Morag's work there. We know that poverty is not a personal thing, it's a systemic thing, yet the culture of poverty discourse sees it as personal, as others have mentioned. And I think we need to think seriously about how we're talking about the pandemic as well. We keep talking about, and our politicians keep talking about, lost learning. And I think that's an incredibly unhelpful term. First off, we have no idea what's been lost yet. And why do we assume that learning has been lost? If I lose my keys, they're somewhere. Where is this learning that's been lost? And what about the learning that's been found? We seem to have an entire generation of children who are growing up with skills they might not otherwise have had. We need to look at that. We need to value that. We need to build on that. But we assume learning is lost because it wasn't in school. And we assume an unbreakable connection between school and learning. Yet, as I've just shown you, that's not true. It's not a thing. And we assume that this is learning and that that is not. But when you think about the really important bits of learning that go on in life, they can go on in both places. And the idea that children have lost learning because they weren't in school is problematic, I think. And also, we talk about, and the media talks about schools having been closed. Well, if you've had anything to do with schools, you know that schools haven't been closed at all. I've been in hundreds of schools, and every time I'm in a school, people tell me that it's not the building, it's the community. And school teachers, school leaders, everybody involved in school communities has worked harder than ever across this pandemic. And we need to challenge this. We need, every time somebody says, well, schools have been closed or teachers have been off, we need to challenge this because it's not true. And it's immediately saying to young people, the learning that you've done over this last 2 years is worthless because it's not the learning that I can test. We need to not do that, and we need to actually value what's going on. And I think when we talk about getting back to normal, I think we need to think about what we've learned and what we can value. For example, a Zoom meeting like this, there are people from all over the country here. We need to not lose that. And the research that's coming out, with some of the research we've done in Wales and research in other areas, there seems to be an increased understanding between parents and teachers and an increased rapport between parents and teachers. Parents have been sitting in on teachers' class, teachers have been talking directly to parents. There's an understanding, and there's an understanding that an awful lot of teachers are parents themselves, and they've had to deal with everything that other parents have had to deal with as well. We've learned about effective utilization of online tools for teaching, for learning, for parents' evenings. A lot of schools move to online parents' evenings, and for many parents, they work very well. For other parents, they don't work at all. So we need to not think that everybody is the same and actually think, what have we learned? And there's an increased understanding of the role that parents can play. We need to change some of the messages. And the messages that we need to get across to parents are that what matters is they care about their children and they care about their learning. They do not need to know the answer. And if you've ever raised children and had children go through the school system, you know that when they're very little, you can answer their questions. Although one of mine asked why God made the dinosaurs first, and I'm still not sure. But as children age, they ask you questions you can't answer. They study things in school you didn't study. And this feeds into parents feeling like they can't help. We need to let parents know that what's really important is they say, no, I don't know either. How do you think we can find out? Parents don't need to know the answer. They need to care that the answers get found. And the message we need to get across to staff is that what matters is that parents engage in learning at home, not that they come into school, and we really need to break that barrier. And we need to start from what everybody has in common, which is a desire to support the learning of the young people. We need targeted and responsive and culturally appropriate support for parental engagement with learning. And that needs to be designed in conjunction with parents. Schools often tell me, oh, we put something on and parents didn't come. Did you ask the parents if that's what they wanted? The International Parents Association strapline is nothing for us without us. So we need to design things in conjunction with parents, school staff, young people, and researchers, because we know what people have said across the piece. And we need to evaluate them effectively and implement them in partnership with families. There are resources that I'm sure that you know, and if you don't know, please go and find the cost of a school day. If you have anything to do with schools and you're coming up to Halloween, please don't ask people to come in costume. Make costumes in school. And the same with World Book Day. Buying a costume at Aston never helped anybody's literacy, but it did push some families into not eating. Look at the cost of a school day. Look at poverty proofing the school, and Child Poverty Action Group is very, very helpful in signposting all of these. You can get in touch with me. Those are my details there. We really need to think about what we're saying, think about the assumptions we're making, think about where we're coming from, and help parents to help their own children, because that's what they want to do in the first place. Because really, this is what we're after. And in the first image, this image is in the Creative Commons, you can use it. The first image is equality. And if you're my height, you spend a lot of time in supermarkets asking people to get things down off shelves for you. The second image is just about where the school system is now, where we're working at equity, everybody has what we need. But what we're aiming for, what I'm aiming for anyway, is the final image, where we no longer need accommodations because we've got rid of the system that causes the accommodations to be needed in the first place. The final image is liberation, and that's what we're working on. Because in reality, what we're working for is happy families and children that can grow up safely and securely and learn to the best of their abilities. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Janet. And that image of the barrier being removed is just such a great one to end on. So thank you so much for that. We are almost coming to the end of our time today, but I was hoping that we'd have time with our panelists for maybe just one or two quick questions, if you don't mind. So I know that a lot from the chat, a lot of people who are with us today are actually frontline staff, so working either as social workers or in schools. And so I was wondering what suggestions the panelists may have for us to sort of tackle stigma and shame in our everyday roles, if there are any changes we can do to the way we work. I know that the Cost of the School Day team, for example, experiences a lot of stigma in schools. So do any of our panelists have any suggestions on how we can address that in our everyday roles? Yes, please go ahead, Janet.
Be that person. Be the one who stands up and challenges. Be the person that people are thinking, oh, I can't tell that joke in front of her. Be that person. Be the challenge.
I think representation is really important as well. I think if we're thinking about, Gypsy Traveller and Roma children, they don't see themselves in school. They don't see themselves in the teachers. Improving diversity and inclusion. We have the vehicle with the new schools curriculum and the race equality action plan in Wales to really create concrete change. So I'd see that as a real vehicle for increasing inclusion and diversity.
Yeah, and the other side of the coin that Allison's just described is the fact that education, social work, perhaps increasingly, but certainly are in part education more than social work, quite middle class professions. So what you have is you have a workforce that, as Janet points out, is reflected in the middle class parents that they come into contact with in education anyway. So they understand each other and they don't understand poverty. It's not a core component. I'm speaking to someone that teaches in a university, and I've been asked to go in and do a session with social workers and do a session with teachers, trainees on poverty and how it affects families. It's not, it should be at least a semester-long session. They should have to do a project, a piece of research. They should have to go in and just focus on, but they don't. So they don't understand it. So what we need is we need some, either at the initial education level or at the continuing professional development level, we need something that lets them understand that poverty is a political choice, not an individual choice. And it's not down to families to choose their poverty, but it's down to how policies hang together, how that affects, and also how it affects individual groups, as Allison says. So when teachers don't, or social workers don't see themselves in the people that they represent, then there's a barrier there. So I think you can do that in part by training and education, but it is about diversifying that workforce and certainly the knowledge of the workforce too.
That's really useful. Thank you, Morag. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time today, so I'm going to say a big thank you to all of our panelists today. I think everyone here probably enjoyed the presentation very much. I know I did. And also a big thank you to all my colleagues who are working behind the scenes today, making sure we could make this happen despite some of the tech mishaps that are inevitable. As I said in the chat, I will circulate a link to a recording from today's session, and next week we'll also have some visual summaries drawn by an illustrator and a couple of additional resources, maybe some slides and some links. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.